Hi there, and welcome to this third video of our CashCalc training series. If you remember the first video, we very much focused on getting a client onto the system, adding their details, and really focused on the settings of CashCalc and how each one of the settings in the background does kind of modify and tweak various different aspects of the system. The second video very much focused on getting the client data into your CashCalc account. That could involve using an integration to a third party like a CRM or a platform, putting the data in yourself manually, or path of least resistance is to use the CashCalc portal, where your clients can log in, add all their data, and then that then will kind of feed directly through into your system that can then be pushed into a Cashflow tool. So this third video is going to very much focus on the cash flow element of the system. So probably arguably the most important video of the series. How do you take all of this data that you've gone and collected and aggregated and is now sitting there in your CashCalc account? How do I take that and just push that into a nice cash flow and then start adding kind of different layers of complexity on top? So to get started, we need to select a client first, because you can't build a cash flow without picking a client. So if I look at all my clients on this system, I want to draw a cash flow for Mr. Baker. So Mr. Baker and his wife. Now, if I click on him, get all my client pages load up. And if you remember from the last couple of videos, that info tab's pretty important, because that's going to house all of the data I've collected for a client. And to note, all of that data that's being stored are just segmented neatly under these little tabs up here. So if you click on the risk profile tab, if you've done a risk profile with the client on the portal, which I have, Mr. and Mrs. came out as a 4 long, that's going to be held in here. Again, to note, if you remember the first video, we went through the settings tab and I explained that you can build in your own risk profiles and build in your own asset allocations. So again, do bear in mind, I'll be using the default e-value one or EV one in here, but you're more than welcome to build your own and have something else pulled through. But that's Mr. and Mrs. risk profile. It's also stored their investments, their pensions, their assets, which is their house, incomes and expenses, any liabilities in terms of mortgages or loans, etc. And if they've done a sustainable ATRQ, it'll be in here. All of that data is now stored neatly in CashCalc. So if I wanted to take that data and push it into a cash flow, I don't need to open up a cash flow here and just start on a blank canvas, because I've got the data already. I might as well use that. So if I just click on Update Calculator at the top, just want to call this current situation, not very imaginative, but we'll just use that current situation. That's what the cash flow is going to be called. And straight away, the system's gone and selected all the things I want to pull across. So savings pots, pension pots, incomes and expenses. It automatically doesn't include the assets, i.e. the house. You can bring that across if you want, nothing to stop you, but a house is illiquid. So ultimately, for the most part, you'll want to show the liquid pots and how you can kind of move money in and out of them. Clearly, I can't just sell a few bricks at a time on my house if my cash flow ever gets into kind of negative territory. But I will show you how you can include houses, and actually I think there's some value to including the kind of the house asset within a cash flow. But I'll bring that in a minute, because it will give me an excuse to show you how to add pots. So I'm just going to click on export. That will export that data into a brand new cash flow. And all that data within the info tab has been pushed into the cash flow. Before I get onto the cash flow, though, note again under assumptions, it's assuming that I want to use a 2.5 inflation rate. And again, if you remember on video 1, I showed you how to kind of toggle the default for inflation, but I set it at 2.5, hence why that's always going to be 2.5. But again, I can flex that either way. I also want the forecast to end when the client's 100. And equally, there's a really useful events and timeline, which we'll get into the weeds of in a few moments. If I click on my savings pots, as if by magic, all of those savings pots have pulled through the pensions and the investments. And again, I can add a new one if I want very quickly. Incomes and expenses have pulled through as well. But again, I can add incomes and expenses quickly, which we will do in a few moments. And also there are quick adds as well. So I can very quickly add a state pension if necessary. We'll get on to contributions and withdrawals and charges. But straight away, without really having to do anything other than hit a button saying I want to create a cash flow, I've got one. It's taken all of that data. It's giving me basically year-on-year review. And if I hover over any bar or brick, it shows me what it is. So this is the Aviva pension. It's all color-coded at the bottom, of course. But it shows me that Aviva pension is currently worth 280, but collectively with all my pots, there's about £865,000 in terms of that net wealth. And as my client starts getting older and working until retirement, that pot's worth just over £1 million. And as they then retire and start eating into those pots and drawing down, finally they get to, if they live to the ripe old age of 100, then there's a slight deficit there of about 38,000. Now, just to bear in mind a couple of things here, the order at which these pots are being eaten away, at the moment there's a current account, which I'll get onto in a minute, but it's eating away the big pensions first and then the investments at the top. Clearly, there's going to be a lot of occasions where you want to move these, the order at which the system takes the money from by default. Just bear in mind, under the savings pots, the order at which they're displayed here dictates the order at which they're going to be taken from. So I want to reverse the order. For this, it would seem logical that they take the money from the pensions last and kind of eat away at that ISA and the premium bond first. So I'm going to move all of these down. And if I now go back to my cash flow model, that it kind of it's quite a nice way of actually showing the slight tax advantage of doing it that way instead, because suddenly the deficits come down a bit to 18,000. Now, back to this current account, there is a surplus every year. So every year, the client's making more income than they are spending it. And if I go into money in, money out at any time, it shows that a bit clearer. It shows me that every single year, this is the income, so this is Mr. and Mrs. salary. Their salaries add up to about 52,000, and their expenses every year is about 36,000. So there's a really nice amount of surplus there that's being kind of saved into that current account, and then obviously the salaries wash away when they retire, and then the expenses being met by the savings pot. So it's a slightly different way of looking at kind of the cash flow report. And equally, you've got that under yearly breakdown as well. If you ever hit that, it shows you year on year, the client's making 52,000 a year between them. They're spending 36,000. So there's a nice surplus of 16,000. But at the moment, that 16,000 is just being added to this pot, and it's growing and growing and growing, and that's the first thing to be taken away. Now, your clients would understandably argue, well, hang on a sec, there is a surplus every month, but if they're anything like me, they don't actually see that at the end of the year, because invariably it gets spent on stuff. So if I wanted to take that away from the cash flow, if I click on incomes and expenses, there are two ways of doing this. This gives me an excuse to show you how to add an expense. So if I click on add an expense, I'm going to say, look, this is cars and holidays, and I'm just going to make that 16,370. And I want to do that every year. That's a new expense. Worth pointing out, you can do custom frequency. So for big things like car purchases or big holidays every so many years, you can say, look, I'm going to buy a car every 5 years and I want that expense being taken into account. But in this case, I'm going to do every year from the age of 59 up until that client retires. I want to escalate that at my inflation rate at 2.5 and add the yearly expense. And it just adds that in at the very bottom. And if I go down to my cash flow model, suddenly the excess has worn away. My obviously my deficit's gone a bit bigger. And then if I click on yearly breakdown, it completely takes it away for me. So maybe a bit cleaner. Now, there is actually another way of doing that, which is maybe a little bit more elegant. If I come back to my expenses, and just to show how easy things are to delete, you can just literally click on delete. Delete takes that away, goes back to what I had a second ago. And if I come back to my cash flow model, if I click on options at the very top and advanced assumptions, you've got the surplus that's being created. How much of that you're going to be putting into savings or that current account? Well, at the moment, 100% of it is going into my savings account or current account. Well, actually, I don't want any of it. And I can pick a percentage in between those figures, 0 and 100, and there we go. It's completely taking it away. Another thing to bear in mind is that back to that house, or just adding pots. If I suddenly wanted to add a particular pot, if I click on savings pots at the top, I can click on it anytime. I can click on this button, and there's the current account, by the way. And if I click on this pot, I can say, look, I actually do want to focus on the house. I think it was one, is that enough zeros? 1.2 million was the house. I'm going to assume that house grows at 2.5% inflation. I'm just going to assume it grows at inflation over the coming years. Now, obviously, there's an argument to have it growing slightly more than inflation, but for the purpose of this, I'm just going to leave it at 2.5. So it just stays static at 1.2 million kind of real worth. Incidentally, if the pot is a pension, you can click on that, and then you can add the withdrawal tax rate. So when my client actually comes to take the money from these pensions, it is going to default anyway for the other ones I've built in here. But for this one, I want to say, look, yes, 20% of that needs to be moved to one side to pay the tax. And equally, if each one of those withdrawals, there's a 25% tax-free allowance, I could theoretically just move that down to 15, and that's the appropriate rate of tax for people getting tax-free, the 25% tax-free. Equally, I can lock the pot, which is important. So when that cash flow goes into deficit territory, negative territory, it's going to look for pots to take money from. Well, I don't want it to take it from this pot because it's my house. Again, as I said, I can't just sell I could theoretically just sell my garage or my driveway, but it's unlikely. So I just want to lock the pot, make sure the cash cow doesn't take any money from this, and I want to lock the pot from the entire length of the forecast, and click on add. And if you see at the very bottom, it's always giving me a dynamic update on my cash flow, starting, retirement age, and end date. And if I come to my cash flow model, I think that looks quite nice. I've got my house at the very top there, always remaining static, keeping up to pace with inflation. And there's all my liquid assets underneath it, slowly kind of wittering away. And then underneath that, there's the deficit. And suddenly the deficit doesn't look as scary anymore because I've got my big asset on top of that to remind the client, well, look, although there's a deficit of minus 191,000, you have got that big asset of 1.2 million that we can then theoretically at that stage leverage to draw some money from and cover presumably that excess. Now, equally, I might want that at the bottom. So same as before, I can go to my savings and move that. It's kind of the opposite way around on the ordering. So if I move it to the top, suddenly on my cash flow it's at the bottom. And one could argue that's maybe a little nicer to look at because it kind of shows my foundational wealth at the bottom there. Well, I wish it was, but that this is my client's foundational wealth, their 1.2 million pound house, and then those liquid assets at the very top, slowly coming away, and then the deficit at the very bottom. But it never reduces the value of my house with the deficit. So I'm just going to delete that. That's just to show you how to add pots of money, and in particular, adding potentially a house. Now, the other tab we should just quickly cover off is contributions and withdrawals. So there will be lots of occasions when you're using CashCalc that you want to move money in and out of different pots. There's loads of different scenarios here, but one of those scenarios is just simply adding a contribution to a pension. So my client's getting paid by their employer X amount every month. I want to include that within the cash flow because that's going to improve the cash flow somewhat. So if I click on add contribution, I can say this is for the pension contribution, if I can spell that. And is it just moving money from one pot to another within my cash flow environment? No, it's not. This money is coming from an external source that the CashCalc and Cashflow doesn't know about. So what's coming in? Well, £750 is coming in from the employer every single month, and that's coming in from today up until the client retires. And again, I can set my own. I'll come on to these events in a minute, but own ages. And what pot's it going into? Well, it's going into my current employer scheme, and I'm going to escalate that at 2.5 inflation. But again, you've got a couple of different options there. Don't increase with inflation or put a custom rate in there. And I'm going to add my monthly contribution. And as you see down there, suddenly the deficit's gone down from basically minus 190 on to minus 108. So that's how to add a contribution. If we come down to cash flow model, you can just see that there, the deficit coming down slightly. Now, I want to maybe punch this cash flow and maybe mimic different scenarios that might happen down the road in life. If something negative happens, how is that going to negatively impact my cash flow? Ultimately, I want to stress test it a bit. So there's a couple of ways of doing this. There's a really neat little tab up here, and you can also do the same over here for clone. If I click on this tab, it allows me essentially to duplicate what I already have. So this is what's the problem I want to try and forecast. Well, it's going to be long-term care. This is one good one to look at. So this is long-term care problem. Now, do I want to start afresh with a blank canvas? No, I want to clone from an existing forecast. I've only got one forecast on the system for Keith Baker, so it's his current situation, and I want to create. And what the system does, again, like internet tabs, are just a current situation and my new LTC problem. They're just duplicates. All of the inputs and outputs are the same. But now I can start adjusting and making changes to this, but it doesn't affect the original one, and I can very quickly compare them. So what do I want to do? Well, I want to come back to expenses, and I want to add an expense and suggest that what happens if that client goes into long-term care. If I click on add expense at the very top, I can say this is my LTC costs. In my neck of the woods, it's about 4,000 every month. I want to start that maybe when the client's 75, all the way until the end of the forecast at 100. Then we'll escalate that again at 2.5, add monthly expense. So there's a problem that we're trying to see what would happen. And if I come to my cash flow model, it's looking suddenly pretty bad. Suddenly my deficit is well over 1.1 million and kind of in line with what that house is worth. So it's pretty much going to eat away the entire asset potentially. So what you can then do is then start adding these different incomes, expenses, contributions, withdrawals to different events to make your use of CashCalc a lot easier. So what I mean by that is if I now wanted to change this and say, well, actually, okay, this comes into play when they're 75. What does this look like if the client's 85? Because clearly that's going to massively affect the cash flow. Well, at the moment, I'm going to have to come to expenses and edit that, change to 85, save it, and have a look. Now, there could be a number of incomes and expenses and contributions, withdrawals pegged to this particular event. And now I'm going to have to change all of them, not just one. So one way to combat that is come back to my assumptions. You've got this really neat events and timeline down here. Also worth pointing out, all of those cash flows pulled through as well. They're kind of listed up here, and I can very quickly change them, but I'll come back onto that in a minute. This is my events and timeline. So I'm going to create a brand new event. You can use some of the ones pre-baked into the system. You can really use your imagination here. And I'm going to add a new event, and I'm going to call this my LTC costs for Keith Baker, or it doesn't really matter, it could be both. And if I click on save, it doesn't do anything to the cash flow. It's still going to be minus 1.1 million because I'm just changing some of the settings in the background. But it means that now I've got an event. I've already got the retirement and life expectancy events. But if I'm ever adding things like an expense, if I come down to my LTC costs again, instead of changing the age to a particular age, I can change it to, or peg it, tether it to a particular event, like my new LTC costs. And again, I'll save that. Now, again, that doesn't change the cash flow either. But what it means is it's a darn sight easier to change, because if I start tagging a lot of things to events, whenever I need to change the cash flow, all I need to do is come back to my assumptions page and just move that. Okay, I'll move that. Now, what happens if they suddenly, that long-term care cost comes in when they're 85? Well, significantly changes the cash flow. You can see here. So you can imagine that that's kind of like an intermediate use of CashCalc. But over the years, or over the months and years, if you use that more often as you start building really complicated and complex cash flows, if you start pegging things to different events, it becomes a lot easier to kind of tweak things. And it looks particularly good in front of clients as well. So that's my problem. I now need to create a solution. What is the solution that I'm going to provide this client to kind of combat this massive great deficit we've got? Well, I first of all need to create another cash flow. So if I click on this tab and do exactly the same as before, this is my LTC solution. I'm going to clone from the existing forecast, and I'm going to clone that LTC problem, create. Now I've got three, two of which are identical. And my solution is to basically transfer all of these assets into one pot, managed by me, of course, as the advisor, but investing in something a little different that's taking slightly more risk based on their risk profile. So I'm going to come to my savings pots. That equates to 750,000. So I'm going to delete these two small ones. We're going to move that one. We're going to transfer out of this one as well. And I can just simply repurpose this one here. I can click on edit. I can say this is my advisor plan risk profile 4, whatever you want it to be called. It's 750,000 because I'm amalgamating everything together. Now, if I'm suggesting that we're going to take a bit more risk, then theoretically I could make the argument and assumption that over the years we should get better growth, maybe 6%. So I could just simply forecast that. What does it look like if I provide for you a better solution, or better performing solution? However, a slightly more elegant way of doing it is to use a variable growth template. Now, again, because I've had the clients complete a risk profile, and the system knows what risk profile they are, the risk profile 4 comes through because it knows the client's risk profile 4, and it has all of my long, medium, and short risk profiles. And this client came out as a 4 long, so I'm going to use that one. And what it does is it uses some quite clever maths and logic in the background to look at the asset allocations, look at historical performance and forecasted performance, and comes up with a much more realistic returns figure based on that risk profile. And again, if you watch the video one of ours when we went through the settings, you can build in your own asset allocations, and you also can build your own variable growth templates and plumb them in here as well. It's worth pointing out you have got a couple of other options. Anyone using RFEI model portfolios, they're already plumbed in, and you've got these useful example benchmarks as well. So you might just want to use basically the mixed investment sectors, cautious, balanced, adventurous. So I just want to use a generic adventurous solution or cautious solution, etc. And again, the variable templates that you can build under that settings are all in here. So you can really go to town and build bespoke ones. But for me, because I'm using the risk profile with EV, I'm going to select long term, and I click on update. Give that a second, and that will update my cash flow accordingly. Now, before I look at the cash flow, also worth pointing out charges and fees. I can start adding a fee to this, because clearly if they're going to be using me from now on, that's going to cost them. because I don't come for free. So if I click on add charge and fee, I can say add advisor fee, 0.5 or 0.8, whatever, and I can apply it to a particular pot. However, because the system knows that my client is a risk profile 4, again, if you haven't watched the video one, I would strongly recommend doing it after this one. Under the settings on video one, that you can bake and tie and tether a charge to a particular risk profile. So I've done that on here. So I've told this system that anyone that comes out as a risk profile 4 will have my advisor fee of 0.5%. So it means that I can click on quick add risk profile charges. I can say my advisor fee that I've already plumbed in, that's a 0.5%, and I want to apply that to that pot and click on add, and that just gets added automatically for me and applied. So again, we're all about trying to save a few seconds here each time, and if you add up those seconds, turns into minutes, turns into hours over the course of using this system for a long period of time. And if I now come into my cash flow model, I've suddenly got a pretty decent solution here. You'll notice it looks a bit different because it is a variable growth template. Some years it will go up, some years it will go down. So it's not just going to be that flat 4, 5, 6%. But it's a nice way of saying, well, look, this is my problem. This is my solution. And if I wanted to put them side by side and compare them, I can click on compare forecast at the very top there. And I can say, I want to look at the problem at the top and I want to look at the solution at the very bottom. Again, particularly if I'm running this in front of a client. However, I might want to go that one step further and still continue stress testing, because if only really looks at one situation or solution here, what about other ways of, again, punching the cash flow and trying to get it into negative territory to try and figure out what we would have to do, or what life would have to throw at us to get this into kind of deficit territory again. So if I click on stress test and Monte Carlo, it brings up the cash flow that's currently again baked into the background, and I can start simulating market events. And I'm going to reference that video one again. If on video one, when we went through the settings, again, because you can build in your own variable templates, you'll have them up here. So there are ones, again, built in for you that you can use as stress testing. But again, you can build your own under that settings. But I want to mimic a particular event in history, like the famous credit crunch back in 2007. What happens now if that happened again, with those kind of loss of growth years and the big fall off the edge of the cliff? What happens if that hit us or hit my client when they were 80? And I want that to hit their investment pots, which are those two. Run the simulation, you'll see suddenly a massive spike up and down. And if I apply the changes and close, I can come back to my cash flow and it will automatically apply that massive drop. And then you can see what kind of negative territory we're looking at. And I can apply as many as I like. I can really, again, punch as many times as I like to see, what life would look like with more and more events. Equally, on top of that, you could run a Monte Carlo simulation. So I'm only running, 2 simulations here, the original one and this one. Well, let's add another 10,000 to it. So if I click on Monte Carlo, these are my different pots. That's my advisor plan risk profile 4 solution. I want to run a Monte Carlo. At the moment, that solution's worth 750. I want to make sure it doesn't go below 0. I don't want the client to run out of money, essentially. Again, you can build your own risk profiles into this and they'll pull through, but the ones kind of the default are E-value. So I want to tell the system the client's a risk profile 4. There are 4 long. The asset allocations pull through, and I want to run that over until they're 100. And if I run 10,000 simulations on top of the 2 that I've already got, give that a second or two, it will, the green bars in the background are the current cash flow, what that looks like. And then it's running, again, 10,000 simulations over the top of it and saying, okay, well, if there's a bull run for the next 30 years and there's no disastrous events that occur, then one of these gray lines is showing that basically triples your wealth. However, if there's a bear run for the next 30 years and maybe lots of market events occur that really force your investments to go down and draw down at a higher rate, then these gray lines show that you could potentially run out of money by kind of worst case scenario, kind of what's that, kind of 80, 85, 86, and then all of the simulations in between. You got a high, mid, and low figure as well. But the most important takeaway here is that out of all of the simulations we're running, 70% of them ended up positive. It ended up above that 0 figure. So again, it's just proof to the client, if I save this, that I'm not just taking one simulation. I'm looking at thousands and thousands, and really stress testing this. And this is the value I'm hopefully bringing to the table, which is why I'm charging that 0.5%. And every single year thereafter, we can just refresh these figures and make sure we're on track to ensure that, these simulations should hopefully ensure that if you're lucky enough to live until you're a ripe old age of 100, you should have a very good chance of this money being enough for you to live until that age. Even at this stage, not including that home. Then when you're finally ready to create a report, I can create a report actually individually for this one. I can just click on print, and it will give me a nice little PDF of that particular stress test Monte Carlo, which looks quite nice. There's all the inputs, and there's the graphic at the end with that chance of staying above zero. If I just come back to my screen, if I click on create report, finally, you've got the 3 different cash flows that I've created. They'll automatically be ticked. I've got all of the underlying assumptions that I've put into this as well, so I can include those if I like. But if I click PDF and just quickly take a look at this, and that loads up my cash flow report. And as you can see, cover page initially, again with my logo, there's the introduction and overview. There's my LTC solution. There's my kind of incomes and expenses, and these are the different cash flows that we created. The money in, money out, savings over time, year on year. That was for the current situation, and going down to the other 2, all the way down to the bottom. Now, what I could do is, of course, send that to the client. So if I click on, if I download this, let's just call this my cash flow report onto my desktop. Save that. If I close this down, come back into my cash flow modeler, go back into my documents tab at the top here, because this client does use my portal. So I can send them a document. These are all the documents I've sent them in the past. This is, I'm just going to keep this short, cash flow report. Again, you can go to town here in terms of description, cash flow report, dear Mr. Client, see here for your brand new cash flow for this year. The document needs agreement. I want the system to tell me that they've definitely accepted this and approved of it. I want to choose the file. Which file do I want to send them? It's clearly going to be that cash flow report. And if I send that across to them, that will appear down here. Now, again, if I take my advisor hat off, open up the portal, now I'm pretending to be Keith Baker and logging in. I've got an alert, so things pinged up on my phone and emailed me to tell me that my advisor's just sent me something straight into the portal, straight away gives me a call to action. My cash flow report needs agreement. Let's have a little view of it. Have a look at that. It's exactly the same report we just took a look at, and I can confirm that I've read and understand this document, and I accept agreement or the particular report that my advisor sent. And then, worth pointing out, you've got a little message tab up here, so I can send a little message to my advisor, thanks, and vice versa. It's an encrypted message facility. And again, if I come back into my advisor land, so I'll take my client hat off and come back into advisor world, if I just refresh this very quickly, you'll see at the very top here, I've got alerts that will pull through automatically. I'll also have an email sent to me, but if I click on here as well, it will load up the message, say thanks. And again, my cash flow report has been accepted. So that should give you, that video hopefully has given you a really good, hopefully an illustration of how CashCalc works in terms of building cash flows, taking all that data you've managed to aggregate into your system, then pushing that into a cash flow, and some of those options you can kind of overlay over the top. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than just that. There's so many different scenarios you could use this on, protection, mortgages, as we did kind of long-term care. Obviously, every client's going to be slightly different, and therefore every cash flow is going to be slightly different. So hopefully that's enough for now to get you started. The last few videos are going to be very much around our tools tab, so looking at some of the tax calculators we have. Thanks for listening.